Alright, so just because somebody is not your friend doesn't mean that they're your enemy. Okay, so while I make a cup of tea, I'm going to tell you about this. What you've got in wars, you have two sides. Right? What you need to learn to do is live in no man's land. Right. So this is what sitting on the fence is all about. Because when you sit on the fence, you can see both sides. You learn to observe, watch the behaviour, see where both sides are coming from, and then you, if you want to, go into this in a second, you can help both sides, right? So because this is what all wars are. You take one side, and this is, think about, it shows you in Wonder Woman, right? When she goes over the top into no man's land. Alright, so you've got one side who's fighting the other side, enemies. Just because somebody is not your friend does not mean that they are your enemy. So what you need to learn to do in life is put your music on and dance in no man's land. There's a reason it's called no man's land. I won't get into that just yet. Alright, so whether you call it no man's land, which is easily understood through learning history and through wars, you've got either side that are in the trenches, down, submissive, right? And that's where the no man's land becomes a fence, because it's higher. You can see both sides. Alright. Now there's two things that you can do when you're sitting on the fence, when you're dancing in no man's land. The two things that you can do are observe, learn, and you either support both sides. I can see where you're coming from, I can see where they're coming from. This is the sort of middle ground, and you can see progress. Right. Another thing that happens sometimes is the person who's dancing in no man's land or sat on the fence can see both sides. And what they decide to do is they decide to play both sides off against each other. Or they've this or this has done that. Now this is whether you choose to support or whether you choose to manipulate for entertainment value, depends on the type of person that you are. And this is why we get heaven and hell, the above and below. This is where you get angels and demons, right? And it all stems from war, conflict, which, depending on how much you pay attention to the words, flick, movies, flick, entertainment, gods and devils. Alright, that's enough of that. So what I'm going to say is, depending on your perception, depending on where you place yourself, whether you take sides, and sometimes your mind feels strongly enough that you might step off the fence to help one side move, because things change. So, but you don't go so far away from the fence, away from the middle ground, that you lose sight of the other side's perception. And that, remember, that's only on a two-sided plane. The more sides you have, the more you need to learn to maneuver the middle ground to keep the tabletop balanced. Otherwise it's going to tip over. Right. So remember, because in a lot of media, social movements, if you say to somebody, "I'm not your friend," they're going to be quite offended. Because it's an emotional reaction. Intelligently, they shouldn't be offended. Just because somebody's not your friend does not mean that they're your enemy. It might just be neutral. Somewhere in the middle. If somebody doesn't agree with you on one particular area or topic, does not mean that they're your enemy. They may well agree with you in another area, in 2 other areas, in 5 other areas within the shape, depending on how many sides. Yeah? So you get what I'm saying? You're doing yourself out by taking particular sides, and especially with how many different brands and labels and pigeonholes people put themselves in, which is unfair to pigeons. Work on not being so easily offended because somebody has a different opinion than you on one area. Can you imagine? If you're offended by somebody who disagrees or has a different opinion in one area, but they agree with you on 5 other areas, you're really going to fall out with that person because you're missing out on 5 other areas where you can work together to make progress. Don't lose sight of the middle ground. Sitting on the fence gives you perspective. How you use that makes you then the type of person that you always were. You uncover layers of yourself in the experience of life, in the experience of dealing with conflict, learning to manage the middle ground, doing your little dance in no man's land, as they call it. Think about that. Put your music on, learn to dance, sit on the fence, don't be so easily offended.